Heartshine, you bring up Little Pip being the virtue of kindness. Little Pip just thinks she's the virtue.
No, it's Velvet.
Oh, Velvet.
Velvet is,
okay. I'm sorry. I thought you were talking about
remember, with the elements, Velvet is kindness, laughter is Silverbell, calamity is loyalty, and homage is honesty.
I mean, even then you got like the irony of like, oh yeah, the element of loyalty is the dude who has been branded for disloyalty. Well, it's like it's a complicated situation, but I feel like that irony is there for no other reason than the sake of being ironic.
It is, and that was even commented on by Spike himself when they went to his cave, where Spike is like, so you call this person who a traitor wearing the cutie mark of the person who was the element of loyalty. So that there is a sense of irony, and it's it's not typical literary irony, but it's very it's fascinating to think about.
I can appreciate it being there as like a sort of makes you think, but when you think about it doesn't really go anywhere.
It really activates my almonds. It really gets the noggin jogging.
Think emoji.
Yeah.
Bonk.
So, but there is this sense of Little Pip thinking highly of herself, where we're like, oh, I'm corrupted kindness. And as you said, it's that melodrama that goes nowhere. And it's this thing that's constantly going through her head, like, oh, I'm corrupted kindness, I'm corrupted kindness, I'm corrupted kindness. And
we're back to my comment earlier about her having some little uncomfortable points of like possible narcissism. It's and then the world just kind of adapts around her, and it's like,
I mean,
what are you actually saying here?
I mean, that's exactly where I was going with that. Where Little Pip is definitely a bit of a narcissist with that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's something I'll have to bring up in the next podcast regarding narcissism and the possibility of Pip being an unreliable narrator, because I feel like that's worth exploring at some point.
Definitely.
But next time. Yeah. We're on the clock here. We have to get to Camelot now. Can I move on?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I'm still on Arbu here because I have more ethics stuff to talk about.
There is a lot to pick apart with Arbu.
Yeah, because I just talked about some theoretical background. Now, what people actually do in the story, which there is a lot of the party just don't really have very strong opinions. Well, they have strong opinions, but they're not really like based on anything. Steelhooves is initially just like, it's my party, right or wrong, which is okay. That's not really an ethical framework. That's just I don't want responsibility for this. And then it later comes to I suppose you mentioned it as like, great job, Pip, you fucked up. You're as bad at the rest. I suppose I read that as right outcome, wrong mindset, because it does kind of, it does feed into the character arc of Steelhooves, where he's like, yeah, I would have done it, but like, you should have done it with a clear head instead of acting impulsively. And then that comes into the memory orb later in Canterlot. So it's like, yeah, it's okay. But it makes sense why he thinks that way from a character perspective, but it's kind of irrelevant to the ethics discussion. Velvet describes Arbu as mutated flesh that needs to be cut away.
So cancer.
Which is an emotional reaction rather than a rational one, but I'll get to there's stuff to dig into there. And Zenith is like noise of cardboard falling over. Like she just doesn't have an opinion.
Well, Zenith's opinion basically boils down to, well, it wouldn't have been the weirdest thing that it had happened to me this week if I had been back in Philly.
I mean, I guess that does sort of say something about like her background and sort of I suppose there's a concept called the hedonic treadmill, which is your perception of pleasure and pain is sort of tempered by the bandwidth of your general day-to-day experience. It's like, when you see tweets on Christmas Day of like rich kids crying that they got an iPhone for Christmas instead of a car, they are actually feeling absolutely terrible because they don't have anything worse to feel about. It's so that kind of makes sense that Zenith is like her life has sucked so much that Arbu is just kind of it's only like a 6 or a 7,
This is a rather mild footnote, which sorry, I have like so many notes on Zenith on this in this section too, so I feel bad about that. I'm going to try not to rant about her too much. But...
Don't worry. I mean, like my notes are actually shortest and glyph marked because I ran out of time to sort them all out properly, so I can.
The Velvet rant will come when we get to Canterlot and the Ministry of Peace.
I was actually going to put it at Fluttershy's cottage just because there's so much else to talk about in Canterlot.
Okay. When we get to Fluttershy's cottage, that's when we can have the Velvet rant.
Okay, so back to Arbu. We're left with like the main ethical argument being between Calamity and Velvet, and there's like another irony for irony's sake, where they sort of take the opposite perspectives of what you'd expect them to based on their previous characterization, where you've got like Calamity's surface level utilitarianism that he backpedals from is sort of an abrupt change of direction from the guy who's been just openly profiling raiders and shooting to kill from a distance. like that's another aspect of Arbu. Like the main reason that the characters seem to be squeamish about the idea of killing this town is because they're not dressed like raiders. They're just like a town. It's like if these people had spikes and skulls and everywhere, they'd be fucking bulldozing that place.
Well, except interestingly enough, though, too, at the start, and this was something that actually struck it out to me, because he said that they were dressed like raiders, but then she later notes that the ponies that were attacking Arbu initially, which are the ex-Arbuites, I guess. Yeah. Arbuites. That was the worst word. I don't like that rolling off my tongue. I can't get Arbuians. No, that's nice. But anyway, but the point is that like basically one of the things that Pip notices is like, hey, these guys aren't dressed like raiders. That's different. But Calamity's response is, caravan ambush, must murder. Yeah. Because that's worked out so well for him every other time in this series.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess he's not like... I guess he's open to the... I guess he's open to the concept of the bandits that aren't dressed like raiders, but I do feel like there is an element of like the appearance giving people pause. That it's like Arbu plays it being just a member of the community, and it's just like a nice little town, and that is like it throws people, and then meanwhile Velvet just kind of has all of her morality up to this point just thrown in the dumpster. To be honest, I'll get into like the details of Velvet's perspective and how the story doesn't treat it with any respect when we get to Velvet. But this is the part where
although one of the things I thought was funny though about her like taking her like morality's perspective and then like dumpster chucking it is that she chooses to do so while she's defending the remaining kids in Arbu from Pip.
Yeah. I mean,
that entire like morality exchange where she's like, "Fuck it, they were cannibals, and this is a thing to be removed, and blah 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 blah. And I can't believe you killed their parents, but their parents were a blight on society. And hi, kids."
Yeah.
And I'm like, "What? Did that just happen?"
Yeah, okay. It's pretty strange. But the what's interesting about all the arguments that the characters have is that they all rest on there being like they all assume that there is an undesirable them who needs to be destroyed, and this has been a common thread throughout the story, mostly with reference to like raiders. They disagree on how to go about removing the undesirables. And it just kind of exists in... you have this assumption that these people exist in significant number and are irredeemable and cannot be reasoned with, which is a big assumption for the story to make.
Oh yeah,
and it does kind of tie in.
Oh, and that
it does kind of. I think I've brought it up like from the first podcast, and I'll bring it up in the last podcast about Pip being an unreliable narrator, and it's like the possibility that she is choosing as a storyteller to rob these people of the personhood of an ability to be reasoned with. So here's the part where I talk about fascism.
I was gonna say I suddenly saw where that was going, and I'm like, I see exactly where he's going with this.
So
okay,
the philosopher Umberto Eco, in his essay Fascism, he outlines 14 properties of fascist ideology. Now these don't need to be all present at the same time, and some of them they can contradict each other quite often, because fascism is an ideology that doesn't make any sense. But
for the most part, throughout history, every time it's cropped up, everybody's been like, this is the perfect thing, and then 5 minutes later it's like, wait, no, we should stop.
This has gone badly. But there's a few I want to call attention to, because that are kind of related to what I was getting at. There's I suppose there's the cult of tradition, which is a bit less relevant, but it's that thing of we must reconstruct the old glory, which is a bit of a theme in Fallout Equestria.
Yeah, a little bit.
There's obsession with a plot, which is the idea of this threat that is somewhere and must be dealt with, and the idea that pacifism is trafficking with the enemy, which is sort of So in the assumptions that the story makes, the old Equestria must be restored, raiders must be purged, and there is no reasoning with raiders. And also who the story dignifies with being right, which is important, because Velvet has, starts out obviously being a pacifist, but she's the story basically decides that she's wrong and changes her. There's like, I don't want to.
That's concerning.
I don't want to cast aspersions at the author here. Because I think this is more just something, sort of an accident of careless writing, rather than, a coherent worldview that formed the story.
I would hesitate. It's careless because K-Cat has shown to be very meticulous in his writing.
You can be
at times.
You can be meticulous in like the technical construction of a story, while also being completely careless thematically.
Sure.
Because it is also worth mentioning that this story was written at National Novel Writing Month speeds over 8 months. Like, this thing was written very quickly, and basically it would not surprise me if, just things like this kind of popped up by accident and didn't really have time to go back to, and then we get into the whole thing of like, trying to defend your work on the internet, and you end up, defending positions that you're not actually entirely comfortable with, and it's a whole thing. I
was like, sorry, the accident, accidentally writing fascism. I don't know if that's the best thing to have done accidentally, but there's that.
You're just there writing your story, and then you get to the end, and you close the book, and like the cover says Mein Kampf, and you're just like, how did that happen?
Oh no!
I mean, Fallout Equestria is pretty much Little Pip's struggle.
Oh god, yes, it is.
Right.
And like, it's not just in the conversations about. Like, I also noticed that Elder Cottage Cheese's ramblings also kind of have a bit of. I suppose it also comes up with Red Eye as well. Just this, it's all in the assumptions that the story makes about the. What needs to be done that just kind of create this sort of uncomfortable thread here.
And that's something I think that, even when, because we spoke already about virtues and how I think they're ours, but the fact of the matter is that like, that's the problem. And one of the things, and this is something that KCAT even wrote into the pen and paper system that I thought was really dumb, was the idea that, you could become lost to the wasteland. And it's like, that's not how this works. And that's not how that works in real life either. Like, you don't suddenly become so, distraught with how shitty humanity can be that you decide that the solution is to start murdering people. Normal people don't do that. If you do decide to do that, there's usually something psychologically wrong with you, and it's been there for a while.
Yeah, like there's I can't. It's not really like a solid source thing, but this idea of that I've heard floating around that like the cruelest people are often the people who haven't suffered. Kind of related to the hedonic treadmill that I mentioned earlier. It's like they're cruel because they don't realize it.
Well, then there's some of that. There's also, not to get into too much psychology and in the weeds with it, but I mean, there's also the idea that, unfortunately, the more power that you have over other people, the more likely you are to become cruel to them. And that's something that we've been able to replicate several times based on the Stanford prison experiment.
Oh, yeah.
Because
I would
no one has
like
been...
more than...
Well, because no one has been able to complete that experiment, because you usually get to day 3 and go, oh, shit,
yeah,
this is a bad thing.
I was going to say, I'd hope there'd be like more than just the Stanford prison experiment itself, because I'd heard like there's things with that, but you'd know
there were
you'd
things
know more
with that,
about
but it's been replicated several times and several other ways, and often in every single one of them they've had to cut off early, usually because the IRB steps in going, what the fuck are you doing? This is bad. And so far what we've kind of learned about this is that most people really don't do well with power, and that's a bad thing.
Kind of sounds like socialism.
I would.
I was going to argue against that though, because I'm like, oh, this sounds like socialism. No, not quite.
Yeah, that's
more that.
Yeah. I feel like that's a misunderstanding of socialism, but that's by the by.
But more that people for the most part are. For the most part, we tend to have people that realistically, there's a lot less people that are natural born leaders than there are that are people that are actually just kind of willing to kind of go along with stuff. And so forcing people out of that position, that role where they're not used to just going along with things, is really uncomfortable, and forcing people into those roles can often cause issues if you're not naturally like that. That's also the reason why, again, the other side of the Stanford prison experiment and other experiments have done this sort of thing where you basically put a artificially created disparity between two people, is that the people that are actually and again, this is also mirrors things that we see in sociology with minority populations, is that the more that you have this feeling like you can't get out of something, the more likely you are to stay there. It's the same reason why when you're dealing with things from a social work standpoint, one of the most difficult things to actually really deal with when you're working with low-income populations is individuals that have struggled with generational poverty. They've struggled with generational poverty for so long. That's, again, like the hedonic treadmill that you mentioned, that's your norm. And getting out of that doesn't seem possible because your norm is here. And so, and there's other issues that come up too, just because more often than not, if you have low income and you're living in poverty, there's a different language that you use, and so the communication style between the like educated elites that usually become social workers, unfortunately, and people that actually have actually spent time growing up in poverty, like I have, there's ways that you communicate differently because there's two different types of languages. But that's a little bit in the weeds here. But anyway, to get back to the point is that. But with that is that when you don't feel like you have a lot of power and stuff, basically the best way to kind of cope with that situation is much like Zenith, to keep your head down.
That's... I've just been listening with rapt attention. That's all really interesting.
Sorry.
No, it's great.
But that's something that, like, like I said, with those experiments and that sort of thing, with everything that's happening, Pip's perspective on this is the very virtuous aspects of all this. And, there are people that really can't be saved. And I have always hated that argument coming out of there, because one of the things, one of the things that this actually show up a little bit in the very strange tale of Midnight Showers, and kind of shows up later at one point, is in which Pip comments on it, is her disbelief in the idea that ponies and zebras and every creature in the wasteland is not inherently good. But then we have this really weird cognitive dissonance where she's like, yeah, but raiders are and it's like,
yeah,
okay.
That kind of relates to I think it's another one of Umberto Eco's points about I don't know if it was I may just be mixing 2 points up, but it does kind of remind me of the self-contradictory nature of fascism, where I know one of the points is definitely that the enemies are strong and weak at the same time, but you've also got like the plots don't have to make sense; they just have to be there.
Right, exactly. Well, I mean, you're running off of a scapegoat thing. This other is the thing that's the threat, and which the concept of other, and like, you know, we try to make it, you know, everything so monstrous, and the real issue is that it's just a complete lack of understanding that we run into of exactly what's going on. I will rant about that when we get to the Midnight Sparkle chapter, Midnight Shower chapter, though, because I have a lot on that.